Welcome to Through Immigrant Eyes, a podcast created by the Center for Immigrant Progress in hopes of amplifying and uplifting our voices as immigrants. As a grassroots organization, we believe that in order to empower our community, we must first listen to what they have to say. Welcome back. We are joined today by Oscar Cornejo Casares, a Ph.D. candidate at the Department of Sociology at Northwestern University and a doctoral fellow of the American Bar Foundation. Oscar is a sociologist of law, race, and migration researching, specifically researching the lives of undocumented immigrants in the U.S. Welcome, Oscar. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sandra. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to have this exciting conversation to you about the post-DACA generation today.
I'm excited too. Thank you for being with us. So I know you'll be drawing up upon some of the research that you've done in the last few years. Can you talk to us about this post-DACA generation, what it is, and how did it emerge?
Certainly. So, DACA is short for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is a program that was established now about 12 years ago under the Obama administration. It came about as a program after the failed attempts for the DREAM Act, which would provide a permanent path towards legalization, citizenship that is, for certain undocumented immigrants in the United States. And after many failed social movement, collective actions from activists and allies, the movement sort of shifted to focus on the executive branch. If the legislative branch couldn't fix anything, let's focus on the executive branch. And so Obama then came to, not benevolently, but after much pressure from undocumented
Right.
activists to do something about this long growing, settled, undocumented population, specifically those that came as minors. And so in 2012, in the summer, Obama announces Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is something that the president has in his toolkit as part of his executive power. It's a discretionary form. Um, of executive power. It is, I want to be clear, not amnesty, so it's not
Mhm.
forgiveness from the government. Uh, Despite what politicians or others might say, it is not amnesty, and it is not a pathway to citizenship. It is entirely a stopgap, temporary form of legal relief. When it was
And
established, yes.
sorry, by discretionary, you mean that he can choose to do it or not do it, and that also depends on the following precedents.
That's right, by discretionary, entirely up to the president in
Mhm.
power. As we've seen in
Right.
its now decade-long journey, it's gone through much litigation and change. So, unfortunately, under Trump, the administration, as we'll talk about today, it's gone through waves of being active and being rescinded. So, it is entirely dependent upon who is in power, and so it makes it precarious and then for the people who are living under it already live unstable lives, uncertain lives, which have consequences not just for their social life, psychological life, but their educational, professional, and familial, contexts. And so when it was established, it had 7 eligibility requirements, which I have here in my notes. And so basically, these 7 eligibility requirements um, w- are part of the problem in terms of emerging and producing this thing called the post-DACA generation. So I want to highlight a couple that are key in thinking about the post-DACA generation. Um, First is uh, when you needed to have come to the US. You must have been continuously residing in the United States since June 15th, 2007, and also must have been in the US physically present on June 15th, 2012. So that combination of continuous presence and physical presence on a particular date is very hard to meet because not only do you have to prove that you were on that date, um, you have to uh, then have to be in the United States, right? So if you came, for instance, like in my study, among other people, there were 3 people who came after that, 2007 cutoff date, and so they're entirely ineligible for DACA. Even if we, do something about the court litigation that is happening right now, because of the date of arrival, there is a group of people who will never be eligible
Right.
for DACA at all. And this is particularly key for those that are in high school right now. The class of 2023 that just graduated, over 100,000 or so high school undocumented graduates, a majority of them will do not meet this requirement because of, just think of the time of their arrival and their ages. So, right, just simple math,
Mhm.
most of them naturally, by the eligibility, will never have DACA. And so the problem at hand here is that the eligibility requirements is prohibiting access to the program and to the
Right.
benefits that you get for being a DACA recipient, mostly work authorization and protection from deportation. And then there are some secondary based benefits depending on, what state you are, because the local context does matter.
Mhm.
And so you don't have, we're turning sort of to what it was before DACA existed for undocumented youth coming of age and transitioning into adulthood, not having access to the formal labor market or facing significant barriers to attaining higher education. In the state of Illinois, it's a little bit different though, with driver's. That's something that we can have Illinois, but if you're in a state that doesn't have that, that's an issue. So
Right.
we have cascading problems essentially. So the eligibility requirement is of the date of arrival is a problem.
Yeah, and
But
I
there's
also
also a
having
paradox.
having to prove, that you've been here, I can tell you from my experience meeting a few people my age that would have
Yes,
qualified, had everything, the dates, but they moved around so much that they could not keep track of the documents that would prove that they've been in the country.
exactly, exactly. In
Mhm,
fact, there's one person that I had the privilege of talking with. We'll call her Angela Huerta. That's a fake name, by the way.
mhm,
And so she meets all the requirements except proving her date of arrival. And she had come like a decade before DACA was a thing. And so in terms of her history, she meets it, but she must prove
mhm,
it. And so you must
right,
have a paper trail. And so a paradox emerges. On the one hand, legally, you're not supposed to be here.
mhm,
However, you must prove that you are physically here since a certain point. So some perhaps some incompatibility that comes with that. You're on the one
mhm,
hand, you're legally non-existent, but you must make yourself visible at the same time somehow. And
mhm,
so there's a sort of contradiction that occurs in that perhaps the government or the state or society actually does tolerate undocumented immigrants. It's fine that they're here, and so um, that's been a problem for some people, this paper trail. If there is no
mhm,
proof, there's no documentation, it's just not gonna happen for you. But
right,
she did find documentation, but to her local library actually. And so, but by the time she got that documentation and she submitted it subsequently, she wasn't able to have access to DACA because of the court cases that are going right now.
oh,
And so she meets the eligibility criteria, but by the time she was able to find the documentation to prove it, the courts had blocked first-time applicants like herself.
right,
And so that's the other issue that's at hand in proving or being eligible, or rather having access to DACA. And so we've had DACA now for over 12 years. And so under the Obama presidency, the Trump presidency, and now the Biden administration, and even since its beginning, it's faced problems with Congress and the courts, and the presidency, and of course with civil society. But the big problems begin when Trump comes into power in 2017. In that fall of that year, he rescinds DACA
mhm,
entirely, and so begins a long and contentious court battle with the district courts and the appellate courts and eventually the Supreme Court. Many lawsuits emerge from organizations and legal defense funds and DACA recipients and people who don't have access to DACA, right? And so we have forms of collective action, right? So we have a response to the Trump administration. Um, and so these lawsuits emerge, and you might remember also that we have government shutdowns because of DACA.
Mhm.
In fact, one of those government shutdowns in January of 2019 was about the DACA issue and Trump getting funding for his border wall, right? So border wall in exchange for protection for dreamers. But
Right.
there wasn't any resolution, just like the previous shutdown in 2018. So in both 2018 and 2019, the government shut down, no resolution in either case. But the one in 2019 was the longest shutdown ever in US history. Can
Mhm.
you imagine that? Like the whole government, shut down over this issue and no resolution came of it. And so the courts continue to battle those lawsuits that had started over Trump rescinding DACA. Um, and fortunately, by June of 2020, the courts overturned Trump's initial repealing of DACA. Now, it wasn't a decision on the legality or the merit of DACA itself, but
Mhm.
rather how Trump removed the program itself. And so it was a 5-4 decision. And the court said that his decision to remove DACA was arbitrary and capricious. And so but they didn't debate, whether it's legal or not. It was just how
Mhm.
he did it, right? And so,
Right.
but in the meantime, right, we have people who were blocked from accessing DACA. One individual that I interviewed several years ago, we'll call him Anthony. His renewal coincided with Trump rescinding DACA. And so he lost his DACA, he lost his work authorization, his driver's license, right? And so he experienced what in the scholarly literature, we would call generational reverse incorporation. So, meaning all the things that he gained in his life
Mhm.
materially and that have made him advance mobily in his life suddenly were removed and taken away from him. Fortunately,
Mhm.
because the Trump administration's decision was overturned, eventually he gets DACA back again, and he's able to get back some of these things. But at least momentarily,
Mhm.
can you imagine all these things that you had acquired in your life? Now you're able to do them, and suddenly the rug is pulled on under you, and you can't
Right.
access it. And because of the particularities of your situation, it just coincided with it, and it feels like an apocalypse, right?
Yeah, and for the folks listening, DACA gives you a work permit and a social security number that you can only use along with the work permit. But that's connected to your ability to get a driver's license. In some states, there's states like Illinois that allows undocumented people to get a driver's license, but there's others that don't, and you need to use your social security for that. And it's all connected to your DACA, the time that you have it, which is a 2-year period. So when your DACA expires, your license also expires and you have to renew with your new DACA. So that's why everything is
Mhm.
connected, along with like the work permit, having to update it at whatever company you work at every 2 years. So yeah, that's connected to like almost every aspect of your life.
Exactly. And then when we get to the Biden administration, um, oh, and then another, so the Supreme Court overturns Trump's DACA
Mhm.
decision, and then a judge reorders to reinstate DACA in December of 2020 to its pre-2017 sort of terms before
Mhm.
Trump did anything. So there was a window for some time for people to submit their materials, which one person in my study was able to take advantage of. So he submitted his stuff,
Mhm.
and it was pending, and they received his application. His biometrics got taken, but by July of 2021, um, after Joe Biden is inaugurated and he restores DACA, we have more lawsuits emerge. This time from,
Mhm.
well, including Texas. Texas has a long history of being anti-immigrant, but this another Texas case emerges, and by the time Ignacio, we'll call him, Ignacio is like going through the process, and he finally meets the criteria for being able to access DACA, the court again block access to first-time applicants, just like how they had done in
Mhm.
January of 2018. And
Mhm.
so there are no new applicants, no new first-time applicants, including Ignacio. So Ignacio had submitted his stuff, and then suddenly in summer of 2021, that this Texas course blocks it and he can't access it. And this is the case for some of the, younger Gen Z, because they're coming of age, right? They're
Mhm.
transitioning into adulthood and they're finally becoming eligible for DACA. But then the courts have blocked it. And so they
Right.
would otherwise be eligible, but they can't. And so in the meantime, renewals can continue. Like myself, I'm a DACA recipient and I can renew it. And I've been very lucky and fortunate that everything has aligned positively for me. But for first time applicants, just by the order of their coming into this world and the requirements and the eligibility, once more they can't access it. And this is the case for Antonia in my study, and as well as Vanessa, um, and Lucia in this study, who would otherwise be able to get this, but just they can't because of the court litigation. And so they can submit stuff, which they should, because something might come in the future, but they can't get anything. In the meantime, they're in high school or they're in college or they're working much like other undocumented immigrants would, working
Mhm.
under the table or using what we would call papeles chuecos, or I
Mhm.
call them substitutive papers, right? So these fake fraudulent papers, but I don't really call them fake or fraudulent because it implies criminality.
Mhm.
Papers because they're alternative, but they're nevertheless real, and they're meant to engage with the labor market, right? Because that's the point. And so that July of 2021 court cases has been a significant barrier for the this generation that's coming of age now. So if you did not have DACA status before that, it wouldn't be processed at all, right? And
Right.
so Texas is arguing cost and unconstitutionality, right? And so that was appealed, all right, and it reached the circuit court, and they heard that, and they made a decision on that in October of 2012. They affirmed the lower courts, unfortunately, but at that time, um, Biden had created this thing called the final rule on DACA, and so
Mhm.
that's kind of confusing as to how that. I was like, okay, so what is Biden doing now with it? So basically, he was trying to codify it or make it more formal into the legal code. So try to essentially fortify and protect it, because the arguments that were being waged to get it was that it's just discretionary, it's just a memorandum, it's not this real policy that is embedded in the structure of the law. And so Biden tried to fortify it and codify it and go through some of the formal channels. Um,
Mhm.
into making it formal regulation. And so that bought us some time, but nevertheless, the court said no, it's still illegal. And
Mhm.
so it continues on, and then September of last year, 2023, the district courts made a decision on the Biden's final rule, arguing that it violates the Administrative Procedure Act. Renewals can continue, but no initials first time applicants can go. And so that was the last that we heard on DACA in terms of the litigation. But in the future, this will be appealed to the circuit court, where it'll likely be heard this year. And but based on previous years, decisions, um, it'll likely be deemed unlawful,
Mm.
and so it'll likely continue renewals. It can continue first time. No, but it is possible that they could say for the first time, renewals can't continue. So we might end up with what Anthony went through, us DACA recipients, the 600 or 1,000 or so of us, that we're going to lose the things that we've gained, right?
Yeah.
Regardless, I think it'll go to the Supreme Court, and then where I do think it will be killed. I
Right.
agree with the rest of my colleagues and other academics who say that this decision that will come out maybe spring 2025 or later by the Supreme Court will be the last last time DACA is heard, and it will be deemed unlawful. And so then we're left with questions of, okay, well, what does that mean, and what are the consequences of that in people's lives?
Mhm. And about the date for that potential decision, do we know it's going to come in the spring, or is this still like up in the air and we just have to wait when it happens, it happens?
It's a little bit of both, I would say. It's the best estimation of what I can see and what others have been saying. Right, it depends on how quick the case can go through the circuit court or the appellate court rather, and all that, and then how fast the Supreme Court hears it. Right, so
Mm.
it's best guess, right? So it could be different, but spring 2025 is one potential date as to when we'll hear a decision on DACA. So that's coming up. That's like a year and a half. We really don't have a lot of time left
I
with this.
thought
So this
I
is
thought it was
like
going to be spring 2024, so it's spring 2025 potentially.
25. Yes, for the
Oh
Supreme Court.
wow, for Supreme Court. Okay,
Yes. So,
wow.
right. So we are experiencing the last, I think, of the reign, the era of DACA, right? So, but there
Mm.
are people already who don't have DACA. So what
Right,
have
like
they
we
done?
this has
What
happened before. We've been here before.
We've been here before, right? And so how would this affect people and everything is sort of another topic or another thing I want to talk about. And
Hmm.
so when I've talked to people who have had are coming of age and they're going through their lives and are discovering, oh, there's this thing called DACA and they're excited about it. Um, and then they learn that they don't have access to it. It's
Yeah.
something I want to talk about. So I want to give you this the story of Carla, Carla Rodriguez. And by the way, these are fake names, pseudonyms to protect the
Mhm.
identities of these individuals. So she was born in Mexico. She came as an adolescent, and she can't access DACA because she came 3 years after the cutoff range, so she's not eligible entirely. And so when she first heard about DACA, she said, "quote." She thought it was the answer to all her problems.
Mhm.
Quote, "It felt like this is all I needed. I couldn't ask for anything else. I'm gonna get a Social Security. I'm going to be able to work, and I'm actually gonna get a license. I'm going to be able to do all the things that I felt were so far from our reach." And I got my hopes up a lot. And I'm gonna be honest, I was very hopeful, but then the requirements came up and they said they were gonna try to change them from 2007, 2010, and I was hoping for 2010 because that's when she came, but it was
Mhm.
2007, so she didn't even qualify. And when she realized she wouldn't meet all the requirements, it felt like, "Oh, here we go again, another disappointment. Here's another thing that I don't have." And it was quite devastating, honestly.
Mhm.
Um, and she thought, "I'm probably not gonna go anywhere." It was sad, it was sad, it was sadness for me. And this word of sad or sadness or depression
Mhm.
came up in all of these interviews, all the conversations. A great, profound sadness to be excluded from this on the simple basis of the date of your arrival to a particular context.
Right.
Um, and there's another individual, Rosa, who crossed twice to the US. The first time, if she had been successful, she would have made it into the DACA eligibility. But because she came 2011, a year after Carla, she was not eligible. And so she wonders if God or the universe is the thing that's making her, doing this to her to test her or to, you know, give her a battle so that she can, become a better person. So she's attributing it to something out of her control, which is correct. It is out of control, but it's not a test. It's not okay, you gotta jump this hurdle. But she's trying to justify why this is happening. She's trying to say, is
Right.
it something that I did? Right? And so what happens with this sort of ineligibility is the psychological consequences of it
Mhm.
is that they start to think that it was something that they did wrong themselves. And so they get angry and they get very frustrated and very upset, and that's something Carla was been going through.
Right.
She says that she's felt very angry and very sad about all this. Um, and also very angry at DACA recipients because they take it for granted. And she met
Mm,
one DACA recipient who has said that they've never felt life without DACA, so because they've always had it.
right.
And she thinks that the DACA recipients don't even struggle, but she struggles every day in terms of trying to figure out her life and how to move forward with it. Now,
Mhm.
she's misattributing the true nature of what's going on. The issue is the government, and the issue is the law and the rules. The rules themselves, the regulation itself is the problem. That is giving us these problems, right? It isn't that DACA recipients are inherently the problem, right? It
Right.
is that the state has decided to construct particular rules and laws, created boundaries of eligibility, and but those eligibility criteria have consequences, presumably to divide a boundary between the deserving and undeserving. But Carla asked me why people who came at a particular time are more deserving than her. She
Right.
thinks that DACA recipients are no more deserving than her. Um, and so this is true. And so she's starting to get, a bit more critical here and seeing what the true nature of this is, right? That the problem is, again, the eligibility. And why has the government decided to establish this particular date or any other date as the boundary, right? What is the purpose of
Mhm.
creating a date of arrival? By
Right.
its very creation in nature, it does create marginalization, it creates inequality, and it creates
Mhm.
exclusion. So it's a
Right.
problem by design
Mhm.
that we have
And
these
I
issues.
think it's so interesting hearing you talk about how this person was trying to make sense of it all because it's so out of our control. Like you said, it's completely out of our control. It's people who are making these decisions don't know us or don't have to experience what we're experiencing, and they don't realize how it's impacting us. And the fact that that it's kind of pinning the two communities against each other when if you say DACA and people who were ineligible
Non-DACA.
or just missed by like a date.
Mhm.
It's similar too with people who have DACA. I think we look. I have noticed this in our groups of friends that have DACA. Sometimes they think about citizens, right? And they're like, oh, everything would be perfect if we were citizens, if there was a path to citizenship. And then
Right.
there's people who don't even have DACA who are like, everything would be perfect if I had DACA. So there's
Mhm.
like different levels of that thinking. Like we just need
Yes.
this other thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Those are the hierarchies of
Hierarchies.
deservingness and
Hmm.
hierarchies of belonging based on legal criteria that the state has established. Right? I think of it as a weaponization of space or territory and the weaponization of time. And
Hmm.
so that the state is enacting a particular type of violence by demarcating a certain temporal boundary, right, 2007, but having to
Hmm.
be here again in 2012 and within the United States, right? And so you might think, some people might say, oh, well, the state and the government can create any boundary or any criteria, right, to make certain people eligible for a particular thing, right? But what's the purpose of that? What is
Right.
the end goal of that, right? Because then what you have is you've only had a momentary, solution to it. At a certain point, time will move on in terms of like the calendar, right? But like new generations emerge. So then what are you gonna it doesn't fix
Didn't
anything.
fix
It just
anything. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And in the end, you just have a sense of like including only a little bit of people, but then neglecting the other non. At its height, it was around 800,000 DACA recipients, so like
Hmm.
almost a million. So what about the rest of the 10 million undocumented immigrants, right? And so we
Right.
have consequences by neglect is
Mhm.
one way we can think about it, right? But consequences by design also, right? And so and in the end, what happens is there are, people don't have access to certain things. For instance, I'll share you the story of Lucia. She, when I interviewed her, she was just finishing up her bachelor's degree in the sciences, and she had gone to community college, and then she transferred to a four-year university. Um, she changed careers. She used to be in engineering and then eventually into computer
Mm,
science. So being a Latina, Mexican immigrant, working class, undocumented in the sciences is extraordinary in and of itself. And she doesn't have DACA because of her year of arrival. And so when I interviewed her, she was just coming back from an interview with a company that was trying to hire her. And then, so she told me about that, and then she sent me an email afterwards, and she said they couldn't give her the job. She had all the credentials, the education, the resume, the human capital, all right,
right.
to demonstrate her capacity to it. But because she does not have work authorization, she can't work and exercise the degrees that she has. Same thing with Carla. She says all her degrees are just trophies that she hangs on the wall. She just looks at them and she can't access any of them. So they become decorative for her, and so they're like, "What do I do? I don't have anything that I can do in my life." It feels like their life has come to an end, and so it has a huge toll on them, professionally,
Mm,
academically, personally with them, right? And so these are the consequences of these rules, and the consequences of litigation.
mhm. And I think it's also important to note that it has, like you said, it has consequences. Personally, I think their health is probably something to consider. Like you said, everyone talks about the sadness, about the depression, all the
Right.
stressors going on, again, with not
Yes,
having any control over it. And the uncertainty definitely takes a toll, at least it has, like in my experience. So I
exactly,
think that also
exactly.
is important. Mhm.
Exactly. In fact, when Carla graduated, she told me, quote, "It was a bittersweet day for me." She was trying to take it all in because it was everything that she had worked for, and she had a goal to get a degree. And it finally happened after so long and after all the struggles. But then she felt lost. She was at the end of her trail, her path, and then it was emptiness. Where do I go
Mhm.
from there? And I knew I had to get here, and I got here. But then what do I do now? Where do I go next? It felt like my path had ended and it was empty, like sand everywhere. And I needed to start looking at my own path and making it my own now, because now I don't know what to do. I can't work. My degrees are sitting pretty in my living room, and I can't do anything with them. And she got her bachelor's degree in biochemistry after going to community college, finishing high school, transferring to a four-year
Mhm.
university, and she can't exercise her degrees because she doesn't have the work authorization. Now, she has prospects and interest in going to graduate school in the
Mhm.
sciences. She also she's in the process of legalizing through marriage, but because of her particular case, it's going to take a long, long time for that. So right now she's just volunteering and doing some community action work, right? And so there
Mhm.
are she has felt like she hit her wall. She hit her limit that she can't go anywhere now. A great emptiness, like sand everywhere. And where do we go from here? You're lost, right? And
Right.
so this is what um, people in the pre-DACA generation have endured and experienced years ago. However, I
Mhm.
do want to highlight that the landscape has changed. 2024 is not the same as 1994, for instance.
Right.
And so it's quite not the same as earlier generations, but there is a parallel that we could draw. For instance, if we're talking about the educational context, there are scholarships now that weren't in previous years. For instance, in the state of Illinois, we have the RISE Act that allowed undocumented students to have access to scholarships. Nationally, we have the Dream.us. in the city of Chicago, there's the Star Scholarship, right? So these types of like educational opportunities weren't here 20 plus years ago. And so even though I'm tempted to say it's sort of like what it was years past, it's not quite the same because the landscape has shifted. Another thing is organizations exist now, right?
Right.
We have a whole host of local, state, and national organizations that allow a sense of community to be built that wasn't there before. Um,
Mhm.
we have a discourse around dreamers. That was a thing that didn't exist, and have talked to people from previous generations that were like, "We didn't have any of this. We were on
Right.
our own. There was
And
nothing."
their
So
work
now,
is what created this, right? Thanks to the work that they did
exactly.
is why we have the visibility now.
Exactly, right? We had the coming out of the shadows, for instance,
Right.
ceremonies that started here in the Chicagoland area. We have uh, an infrastructure, essentially, for something to be done, right? So it's
Mhm.
not all grim, but because we're dealing with a structural issue that comes at the highest levels,
Mhm.
that is the problem and where we need to direct our attention to. But at least it's not like we're starting from zero and it is as it was before.
Mhm.
But they can't do much in terms of the labor market. They can't do much in terms of education, right? And so what do they do? Well, for instance, I can share this. Going back to Angela Huerta. She got her master's degree in teaching. And
Mm.
she finished high school. She went to a 4-year college, and then she transferred and got and then she finished her 4 year and then she went for her master's. But that took a lot. As an undocumented student, it was a lot of sacrifice and a lot of money. She's a very unusual case because most of them wouldn't be able to get that far on her own.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's quite an extraordinary circumstance, but she would never have been able to do that without the support of her family and community members and organizations and others. Angels is one participant has called it. But because she has her master's in teaching and because she's undocumented, doesn't have DACA, because she can't prove her year of arrival. Well, she can prove her year of arrival, but she can't apply for it because of the courts. Um,
Mhm.
she has to finesse her way around the system. So she has to rely on what's called the ITIN, Individual Tax Identification Number,
Mhm.
coupled with her founding her own business
Right.
and using that to be hired and paid through that independent business for the teaching work that she does locally at an organization. And
Mhm.
so she has to go about in a roundabout way of the I-10 plus business, right? Or
Mhm.
sometimes other people have to be hired with I-10 and independent contractor, or that might be the same. I'm still trying to figure that out. But it's a combination
Mhm.
of I-10 and being an independent contractor, right?
Mhm.
But so people have found ways, right? It is not like an apocalypse that,
Right.
okay, I can't find anything, but rather your options are severely limited. And so it's not all doom and gloom, and it's not as though that the immigrant themselves is dealing with an insurmountable thing. This is
Mhm.
one of the um, great things about immigrants and undocumented immigrants is that they'll find a way, right, out of no way, right? There is a hustle,
Yeah.
there is a drive and motive. Now, at a certain point, it is challenged and it seems like they can't continue anymore. And I can tell you about when people reach that point. But people are
Mhm.
finding ways around the system, right? And so um, I don't want to suggest that it is entirely the end for for these people that don't have DACA, or even
Mhm.
other people who have DACA, and are worried that DACA is going to be entirely gone and nothing is going to be set to solve it, right? Like, yes, it's tragic, but that sort of motivates us to do things, right? Like we just can't sit idly by and let
Mhm.
this happen, right? Because what is also communicated by these people is a sense of being forgotten, a
Mm.
sense of like that they don't matter anymore, that it's all DACA recipients at this point. Like being undocumented is being a DACA recipient. So everyone else has
Right.
been forgotten, right? So that's what I'm highlighting this because it's only a very small group at this point. 600,000, like the number
Yeah.
has dwindled over the last years for multiple reasons, right? So what do we do about it is the next sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's also the reason why we wanted to have this conversation. It's something we've been trying to talk about on social media mostly, where we have the most following, letting people know that DACA is not the only conversation when it comes to immigrant youth. It's still calling us youth because DACA has been going on for now like almost 12 years, and
Right.
the real undocumented students now are, or students who are just now entering college and the higher education world, they're not having the option to use DACA. So I think it's important to remind people that DACA is not, especially considering the fact that it was like 800,000 something, now it's 600,000. I'm sure we're going to continue to see these numbers drop. And then with the
Mhm.
possibility that it'll end in a year or so, it's time to prepare, I think, for that worst case scenario. But there's people who are already living that scenario. And we need to remember them when we talk about this topic.
Exactly. There's always sort of a plan A that we create. Sometimes there's a plan B and a plan C and a plan D, da 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 da, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of like our hustle mode, right? We can't plan for the future, then we're going to plan for multiple scenarios and
Yeah.
multiple futures that could happen, right? But we can't just sit idly by and just be comfortable with what we have, especially if you have DACA. But also, if you have, if you're a citizen, both naturalized or even American born, I think what I'm also saying here is for us to um, first not forget about the other people that are excluded inherently
Mhm.
by the creation of eligibility criteria, but two, by like the litigation that is produced by or contestation produced by other actors. Like
Mhm.
we can respond to that, right? We can react to that, we can organize, we can collectively do something about this, right? um, One of the students told me, Lucia told me that DACA is a lollipop. I
Mm.
think of it as breadcrumbs to satiate you temporarily, right? Many years ago, another one told me it's false security, right? So don't be sort of thinking, oh, I'm set for life. And even though some of them post-DACA folks would say it's all that they want, no, what they're really wanting is stability and a permanent um, solution to it. So on the one sense, I could say, oh, just expand the eligibility criteria or make it more expansive or have a pathway to citizenship for people, right? But that
Mhm.
what I'm also saying largely is that the problem is that it's the structures at hand that even if we have, an expansion, even if we have legalization, unless it addresses the structural elements that produce undocumented immigration, legally, politically, socially, discursively, we're still then going to have in the future another generation of undocumented immigrants. So, what I'm saying is that these are always going to be temporary things unless you have sort of like a recurring legalization program. Like every 10 years, we're going to legalize the undocumented immigrants that are in the country. So unless you have that continuous, legalization, we'll always have undocumented immigration because it is a fact of the exclusionary nature of immigration law,
Mhm.
the apparatus of the deportation regime, of capitalism, of neoliberalism, of the discursive nature, right? Like who we think of and create as undocumented, right? So illegality will persist, is what I'm arguing. And so then what that means is we must always be working to ensure that we're fighting for justice and making sure that we are not producing the same conditions of exclusion and allowing the state or the government or the law to function as it's currently doing, right? And so that means that the fight will be forever, that the fight is long term, right? And so
Mhm.
if we're doing something right now for undocumented immigrants, yes, we can focus on the DACA recipients, but let's not forget everyone else that's part of the undocumented population in this country. And let's not forget the other issues that are tied to immigration, right? Racial justice, for instance, right? Other
Mhm.
communities, right? So the solidarities and the interconnectedness of these social justice issues, right? And
Right.
so the fight is long term, right? And so it may seem grim now. Today we can mourn, right, if it comes to the worst case, but tomorrow we will organize.
Right. Thank you so much, Oscar, for your insights, for the research you're doing, and for sharing the time with us to talk about this very important topic. And I'm so glad we have someone like you at our reach that we can expand the voice that you have and the research that you have. So, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any final comments that you want to share where people can find more information? Anything like that that you'd like to share with our audience?
Certainly, it's been a pleasure, Sandra. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this important issue. People can find me on Twitter at the UndocuProf. Is my well now it's called X. So on my X handle, the UndocuProf, and to see more of my sort of posts about immigration issues, or you could follow my trajectory in terms of my academic articles that come out in the future on Google Scholar. Still got to set that up though.
Mhm.
But you can be sure to know that I'm still going to be out here fighting. So just remember the Center for Immigrant Progress, and I'm sure that we will continue the conversation together. Here, I'm excited for it. Let's. It may seem like this is the end, and we may think that it's the apocalypse is approaching, but it's not. And it may seem like we're alone and that we are doing this by ourselves. Um, I am committed as a scholar to addressing these problems through research and amplifying voices, and so that's what we're doing here, making sure that these stories are heard and um, that these are the effects of law and the consequences, but to urge us to to keep together in this fight collectively.
Right. Thank you so much, Oscar, for your time.
Thank you, Sandra.